Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Hit the bell, subscribe. We have new content coming out daily. Make sure you subscribe. God bless you guys. Very important book. So it's called Untenable, The True Story of White Ethnic Flight from America's Cities by Jack Cashill. So there is a narrative that stems from academia that the traditional explanation of quote unquote white ethnic flight was just simply and solely because of racism. Jack has a different view, and when he gets on, I'm going to read an excerpt up here and it will segue perfectly into our segment. But the sloppiness that goes into people's analysis of everything can be blamed on racism is very, very harmful. Thomas Sowell dedicated his best book, which is Discrimination and Disparities, on this idea that if there is a disparity, racism is not necessarily to blame. In fact, it's probably not to blame. If you're able to ever introduce other explanations for disparities, the regime becomes less powerful. Look at the Jason Aldean thing. Jason Aldean is out there playing country music and they say he must be a racist. Now they only throw out the frisbee of racism if it's helpful for them. They don't do that when they obviously act in bigoted and terrible ways. And so now we have Jack Cashill, which is great. Jack, welcome to the program. Thank you. I'm going to read this part of your book. I think it's a great segue. I asked one lifelong friend, a rare Democrat among the displaced, why he and his widowed mother finally left our block in the early 1970s, 20 years after the first black family moved in. He searched a minute for the right set of words, and he simply said, quote, "It became untenable." When I asked what he meant by untenable, he answered, "When your mother gets mugged for the second time, that's untenable. When your home gets broken into the second time, that's untenable." In researching this project, I found myself repeatedly stunned by the failure of self-described experts on white flight to ask those accused of fleeing why they had fled. The reason the experts didn't ask, I discovered, is because they were afraid of what they might learn. What did you learn, and what were people afraid of learning, Jack Cashill?
Learning, Charlie, and that's an excellent quote to begin with, because that my friend's story times a million is a story of white flight. And, there was an op-ed in the New York Times just a few years ago that I found actually kind of amusing. This woman named Leah Bustan, professor at Princeton, award-winning author of a book on white flight. She goes through she imagines herself like a Democratic strategist right after Trump's victory in 2016, saying, what caused it? Was it economic insecurity, or was it just pure racism? And so she concludes it was a mixture of the both. And then she ends her article by saying, the odd thing is that none of these people left accounts, and they probably don't even know why they left, right? I had just interviewed 50 people who knew exactly why they left, and they were prepared to tell her. Mm-hmm. And, as a friend, go into the comment section of the New York Times, distrusting New York Times readers, but one after another of the commenters gave these harrowing, hair-raising stories about why they were forced to leave neighborhoods they loved. And they said, how can you possibly, several of them said, how can you possibly write an article about white flight without mentioning crime or schools? And that really cut to the heart of it, because the people who are setting the narrative have never talked to the people who were the victims of their narrative.
Why do you think that is?
I think because there's a deep case of 60s denialism going on. There's several phenomena that happened more or less in the 60s that they're responsible for. One of which was these variety of social programs that made it impractical to have a married husband in the house. Mm-hmm. The other was the moral loosening in the culture that made it acceptable to not have a married husband in the house, but to have children outside of marriage. And the combination of the two, Charlie, led to a collapse of the black family, and yes, with it, a crumbling of inner city black culture that no one wants to talk about.
So the consensus of academia, I go to a college campus and they'll say, one of the reasons why Black America struggles is because of quote unquote white flight, this amount of people that left. Let's just take my home city of Chicago, right? Certain cities that used to be white working class. I think of Cicero. I think of, where the book The Jungle was written, right? Kind of south, it was very Polish, very Czechoslovakian, very Bohemian, and very Irish, and it's not very much that way anymore. The only acceptable explanation when you mention this is because the Czechoslovakians and the Poles were racist. What you're saying, though, is that, well, no, it's actually because their homes and their communities, their local churches and the places they loved became unrecognizable. Build that out more.
Right, sure. And I'll give you a couple of Chicago examples because I talk about them in the book. One is Michelle Obama. Her family, her father's a ward healer, a precinct captain for the Daily Machine. And they're living pretty comfortably in a enclave called Parkway Gardens, which was a co-op, a very high-end black co-op. Their neighborhood collapses around them. So Michelle's mother, Marion Robinson, who's a good, responsible parent, refuses to send Michelle and her brother Craig to the neighborhood public school, even though it's brand new. And they send them to a neighborhood in South Shore, which, as you probably know, which at that time was still, it had been Jewish and it was transitioning.
No, that's right.
The schools, and it was a Class C misdemeanor to do what Marion Robinson did, which was to drive her children 15 minutes away from their neighborhood to go to put them in a school that wasn't in their neighborhood.
They went to Whitney Young. Yeah, I think she went to Whitney Young High School, if I'm not mistaken.
For high school, right.
Yeah.
And what they did with brother Craig, because there's an all-black high school down the street, but for Craig, Marion took a second job to send him to a Catholic school, even though they weren't Catholic. So everyone was affected by the collapse of the culture, the inner city culture, blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics.
Yeah.
It's only the whites were singled out for shame.
Well, that's right. So talk also about, and again, I'm just going to keep going back to Chicago, because I think Detroit's a good example, but Chicago is one I know really well. So you have these 1960 programs where crime exploded, illegitimacy exploded, you had moral chaos explosion, and we kind of memory hold how catastrophic the 1960s were from a public policy standpoint. One of the things that also happened, though, was Cabrini Green and this idea of public projects and vertical housing and almost forced assimilation, which, if anyone knows where Cabrini Green is, it wasn't near Comiskey. Cabrini Green was on the north side in the most unusual place. Talk about kind of central planners that went nuts with this idea of forced assimilation and the consequences of that.
And, it's an interesting question, Charlie, because we're going through that again now. They're trying
yes,
to do
we
it
are.
Again. And you're right. Cabrini Green is a desirable neighborhood. In fact, oddly, Michelle Obama was part of the team that tore it down and displaced all those people who lived. But it was they had this idea, and what happens in my native Newark, I saw it up close in Chicago as well. The dreamers meet the schemers, right? So the dreamers think, oh, we have nice new buildings, we can change people's lives. The schemers are saying, I got a demolition company that can make some bucks off this.
No, that's exactly right.
You can build them up. So they build these high rises. Here's the thing that they won't acknowledge is that initially they worked. For the first few years, they worked as long as the families in those buildings were intact nuclear families. And I found this one book that was very useful for me. It was a unpublished book by a guy named George Langston Cook, who grew up in Columbus Homes, which is Newark, New Jersey's most notorious project. For the first few years he was there, he said it was heaven, because it was all nuclear families, blah, blah, blah. Everyone got along. Milkmen came to the door, made house calls, The buildings everything was beautiful at work. The maintenance was spectacular. And then he says, and he's a black guy, and he's, from family of six, and he's saying, then the welfare families started coming into these buildings. So it wasn't so much the buildings as it was the families, and then the concentration of those families in a given.
The cloistering. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yes.
And they want to do that now, which is crazy.